Some folks say you can tell the worth of a thing by the price it brings. But I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the most valuable things in this world get passed over for less than a cup of coffee. And that's how it was that afternoon when they sold Eliza Hart for 3 copper pennies and a handshake that didn't even bother to look her in the eye. The sun sitting high over the yard, heat pressing down on the packed dirt, men shifting their boots, women whispering behind gloved hands. And Eliza standing there in a plain dress the color of dust, her sleeves rolled just enough to show hands that didn't match the story people were telling about her. Hands steady, still, not reaching out, not asking, just waiting the way a person waits when they've learned that asking doesn't change much of anything. The trader clearing his throat like he was embarrassed by the whole thing, but not enough to stop it, saying something about her being quiet, about her being no trouble, like that, was the best a person could hope for. And someone in the back muttering that even quiet can cost you if it comes with an extra mouth to feed. A low ripple of laughter moving through the crowd like wind through dry grass. And Eliza didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze, just stood there with her chin level, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the fence line where the land stretched out in long, empty miles. And when the coins hit the wooden crate they were using for a table, the sound was thin, almost hollow, like even the money knew it didn't amount to much. And the man who took her barely nodded, already turning away as if the matter was settled before it began. And that's when Caleb Boone stepped forward from the shade of the awning, slow, unhurried, like a man who wasn't interested in the show, but had found something in it worth a second look, his hat low, dust on his boots from miles of road. And he didn't say a word at first, just watched her the way you watch something you don't quite understand yet, his eyes not on her face like the others had been. Not searching for flaws or reasons to pass her by, but on her hands, the way her fingers rested against the fabric of her skirt, relaxed but ready, the kind of hands that knew work, not just the idea of it. And something in his expression shifted, small enough most folks wouldn't notice, but enough to quiet the last of the murmurs. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out low and even, asking the trader if the deal was done, and the trader nodded, eager now to move on. But Caleb didn't move, didn't turn away, just reached into his pocket and set down a few more coins beside. The first, not many, not enough to make a show of it, just enough to change something in the air. And then he looked at her, really looked this time, not like a man buying something, but like a man making a choice he'd already settled in his mind. And he tipped his head once toward the open road, a gesture more than a command, and Eliza hesitated for the briefest second, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but like she was measuring the space between what had been and what might be. And then she stepped down from the crate without help, her boots hitting the dirt with a soft, certain sound, and followed him past the edge of the yard where the noise faded behind them, leaving only the creak of leather, the distant call of a hawk overhead, and the long stretch of land ahead that didn't ask what she was worth, only what she would become. The wagon wheels found their rhythm about a mile past the yard. A steady wooden creak against packed earth, the kind of sound that settled into a body if you let it. And Eliza sat beside Caleb Boone on the narrow bench, her hands folded in her lap, not gripping, not bracing, just resting like she trusted the road to hold them both. Dust rising behind the mule team in a thin trail that caught the afternoon light, turning the air a pale gold that made the distance shimmer. And he did not speak. Not at first. Not when they passed the last split-rail fence or the crooked sign that marked the edge of town, just kept his eyes forward, reins loose but certain in his hands, guiding the team without looking like he was trying. And she watched the land instead, the way. It opened up wide and unbroken, nothing but grass and low brush stretching for miles, a place where a person could disappear if they wanted to, or start over if they knew how. And after a while he shifted, reached into the crate behind the seat, and brought out a small tin cup and a canteen, unscrewing the lid with one hand, pouring without spilling, then holding it out to her without turning his head, and she took it after a second, fingers brushing the metal, cool against her skin, nodding. Once though he was not looking, and drank slow, not like someone who had been denied, but like someone who understood that some things were meant to last. And when she handed it back he set it beside him without comment, the silence between them not heavy, not sharp, just there, like the hum of insects in the grass or the distant call of a bird you could not see. And somewhere along the road the wind shifted, carrying the smell of water ahead, faint but steady, And Caleb spoke then, voice low, saying there was a creek not far, good for the stock, good for the land. And she nodded again, eyes following the line of trees that marked it in the distance, cottonwoods standing taller than anything else around, their leaves catching the light like small flashes of silver. And when they reached it, he pulled the team to a stop, climbed down first, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and checked the harness with quick, practiced movements before stepping aside to let the animals drink. And Eliza climbed down on her own, careful but not uncertain, her skirt brushing the sideboard, her boots finding the dirt without a stumble, and she moved toward the water, crouching at the edge, her fingers dipping in just long enough to test the current, then cupping a small handful to rinse the dust from her hands, rubbing her palms together in a slow, deliberate way that left no wasted motion. And Caleb watched that, not obvious, not staring, just noticing, the way a man notices things that might matter later. And when she stood, she shook the water from her fingers once, then reached for the edge of her sleeve to dry them, not on the rough fabric of her skirt, not careless, but precise, like she had done it 1,000 times before. And he turned back to the team, but something in his jaw tightened, loosened, a small shift that passed as quick as a cloud crossing the sun. And when they set off again, the light had begun to soften, the heat easing off the ground, the shadows stretching longer across the road. And after another mile, the ranch came into view, low and weathered. A cabin set back from the trail with a lean-to on one side, and a barn that had seen better years, the kind of place that did not promise much but did not take more than it needed either. And he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, climbed down again. And this time when he turned to her, there was something like a question in the way he stepped aside, not offering a hand, not assuming, just making space. And Eliza stepped down, straightened, and looked at the house the way a person looks at something that might become a home if given enough time, her gaze moving over the door, the windows, the stack of firewood near the wall. And then she nodded once more, quiet, certain, as if she had already decided to stay. The door gave a low creak when Caleb pushed it open, the sound carrying into the quiet like something unused to being heard. And Eliza stepped in behind him without hesitation, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the single front window, dust floating in the air in slow, drifting lines, the kind you only noticed when a place had been left to itself too long. And the smell was there too, old wood, cold iron, and something faint beneath it, like a memory of coffee that had not been made in a while. And Caleb moved through the room with the ease of habit, setting his hat on the same peg without looking, crossing to the stove to check the ash with a small, practiced motion of his boot. While Eliza stayed near the doorway for a moment, taking it in, the table set off to one side. 2 chairs, one pushed back just slightly, as if someone had once stood in a hurry and never returned, shelves lined with tins and jars, all in order but untouched. And then she stepped forward, slow, not like a guest, not like someone waiting for permission, but like someone measuring the space for what it could become, her fingers brushing the edge of the table just once, feeling the grain beneath the thin layer of dust. And Caleb glanced at her then, just for a second, not interrupting, not questioning, just watching the way she moved. And she did not look at him, her attention already on the small details, the way the window latch sat loose, the way the curtain hung uneven on one side. And she reached up to straighten it without thinking, a small adjustment, but it changed the light in the room, made it fall more evenly across the table. And Caleb's gaze lingered a moment longer than it needed to before he turned away, clearing his throat softly, saying there was water out back and would stacked along the wall if she needed it, his voice steady, offering facts, not instructions. And she nodded once, moving past him toward the back door, her steps quiet but certain. And outside, the air had cooled, the sun dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the yard, the well pump standing a few feet from the house, metal worn smooth by years of use. And she worked the handle without hesitation, the first pull stiff, the second easier, until water came up clear and cold, filling the bucket with a steady sound that seemed to wake something in the space around it. And she carried it back inside with both hands, not spilling a drop, setting it by the stove before reaching for a cloth from her bag, unfolding it carefully, smoothing it once between her fingers before beginning to wipe the table, slow, even strokes, not rushing, not skipping corners, and Caleb stood by the doorway watching again, not in the open, just enough to see the pattern of it. The way she worked as if the room already mattered, as if it belonged to someone worth the effort. And when she finished the table, she moved to the shelf, adjusting the tins so they sat straight, then to the stove, brushing away old ash with a light touch that did not scatter it, just gathered it where it could be cleared, and he shifted his weight, the floorboard under his boot giving a soft creak, and she paused then, just for a moment, turning her head slightly in his direction, not startled, not unsure, just aware, and he spoke again, quieter this time, saying supper would be simple, beans and bread, nothing fancy, and she gave a small nod, reaching for the pot without asking where it was, finding it on the second shelf as if she had already learned the space. And as the first faint sounds of preparation filled the room, the clink of metal, the low hiss of water meeting heat, something changed in the air, not loud, not sudden, just a shift, like a place remembering what it was meant to be, and Caleb remained where he was a moment longer before stepping outside, leaving the door open behind him, and inside, Eliza set 2 plates on the table without looking back. The first sound that carried out into the yard was the low scrape of a chair being pulled across wood, followed by the soft clink of metal against enamel, and Caleb paused where he stood near the fence line, one hand resting on the top rail, listening without meaning to, the evening settling in around him as the light dipped behind the hills, turning the sky a slow, fading orange that bled into blue, and he realized after a moment that it had been a long while since that house had made any sound that was not his own, and even those had been few and far between, just the creak of boards under his boots, the opening and closing of a door, nothing that lingered, nothing that stayed, and now there was something else, something steady, and he turned back toward the porch without hurry, his steps measured, as if he did not want to disturb whatever had taken root inside. And when he reached the doorway, he did not step in right away, just stood there with his hand resting against the frame, looking at the table where 2 plates had been set side by side, not perfectly aligned but close enough to show intent, steam rising faint from the pot on the stove, the smell of beans and bread filling the room in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet right. And Eliza stood by the stove with her back to him, one hand resting lightly on the edge as she stirred, not rushed, not uncertain, just moving through the motions like she had always known them. And he cleared his throat once, soft, not to startle but to announce himself, and she glanced over her shoulder just enough to acknowledge him before turning back, saying that supper was ready in a voice that carried no question in it, just a simple statement of fact. And he stepped inside then, closing the door partway behind him, the hinges giving that same low creak, and he moved to the wash basin without being told, pouring a bit of water over his hands, rubbing the dust away with slow, deliberate motions, aware in some quiet way that the room was different now, that his movements were no longer the only ones shaping it. And when he sat down at the table, the chair held firm beneath him, and he noticed without meaning to that the plates were clean, not just wiped but properly cleaned, the edges free of the thin film he had grown used to ignoring. And Eliza took her seat across from him without waiting for an invitation, but not assuming anything either, just sitting when it made sense to sit. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the low crackle from the stove and the faint wind pressing against the window. And then he picked up his fork, hesitating just long enough to notice that she had not yet started, her hands resting lightly on either side of her plate, waiting in a way that was not submissive but measured, as if she understood something about timing that he had not put into words. And he began to eat, and only then did she follow, her movements steady, unhurried, taking small bites, not because she lacked hunger but because she knew how to manage it. And the food was simple, beans cooked just right, bread warm enough to give under pressure, and he found himself eating more than he had planned, not because of the taste alone, but because of something else, something quieter. And when his plate emptied, she reached for the pot without asking, refilling it with the same careful motion she had used for everything else. And he did not stop her, did not question it, just let it happen. And after a while he leaned back slightly, setting his fork down, his eyes moving to her hands again as she folded them in her lap. When she finished, and there was a small mark along one knuckle, faint but there, the kind that came from work done more than once. And he spoke then, not looking directly at her, asking where she had learned to cook like that, and she paused for just a second before answering that she had learned where she had to, her voice even, offering no more than what was needed, and he nodded once, accepting that, and the silence that followed was not empty, not like before, but filled with something that did not need naming. And after a moment he stood, taking his plate to the basin, rinsing it without being asked. And when he set it aside, he noticed that she was already gathering the rest, stacking them neatly. And as the last of the lights slipped from the window, and the room settled into the soft glow of the fire, he realized that for the first time in a long while, the house did not feel like a place he passed through, but a place that might hold him if he let it. The night settled quiet around the cabin, the kind of quiet that did not press in but stretched out wide, leaving room for small sounds to find their place. And inside, the last of the dishes had been set to dry by the basin, the table cleared except for the faint marks where two plates had rested side by side. And Eliza moved through the room with a steadiness that did not draw attention to itself, folding the cloth she had used, placing it neatly near the stove, adjusting the position of a chair by no more than an inch until it sat square with the table. Small things that did not ask to be noticed, and yet changed the feeling of the space all the same. And Caleb stood near the door for a moment longer than needed, watching without making it obvious, his hand resting against the frame, as if he had forgotten what he meant to do next. And when she turned slightly, not toward him but aware of him, he stepped outside at last, pulling the door partway closed behind him, leaving it just open enough for the warm light to spill onto the porch in a narrow strip. And he sat down on the top step, elbows resting on his knees, looking out toward the darkening land where the last line of color had faded from the sky. And from inside came the soft sound of movement, not hurried, not uncertain, just present. And after a while he heard the scrape of a chair, then nothing, then the quiet again. But it was not the same quiet as before. It carried something with it now, something that lingered, and he stayed there until the stars had settled overhead, bright and steady in the clear sky, before rising and stepping back inside, closing the door fully this time. And the room had changed in small ways, the kind you might miss if you were not looking. The fire banked low but steady, the window latch fixed so it no longer rattled in the wind, and on the shelf a few items had been shifted, not moved far, just enough to make them easier to reach. And Eliza stood near the back of the room, a small bundle in her hands, likely all she had brought with her, and she had set it down beside the narrow bed against the wall, not claiming it, just placing it where it made sense. And Caleb cleared his throat softly, saying that bed was hers, that he would take the space by the door, his voice even, not making a matter of it. And she looked at him then, really looked, not long, not searching, just enough to understand what he meant, and she nodded once, accepting without question, and he reached for a folded blanket from a peg, shaking it out once before laying it near the door where the floorboards were worn, smooth from years of use. And as he worked he noticed the way she moved again, how she loosened the laces of her boots with quick, practiced fingers, setting them side by side near the wall, instead of leaving them where they fell, how she folded her dress with care before slipping into a simpler one, nothing showy, nothing delicate, just practical and clean. And when she sat on the edge of the bed, she did not sink into it right away, just rested there a moment, her hands in her lap, listening, perhaps to the same quiet he had grown used to. And then she lay down, pulling the thin quilt over herself, turning slightly toward the wall, and he lay down near the door, the blanket rough beneath him but familiar. And for a while neither of them slept, the only sound the faint crackle from the stove and the wind brushing against the outside of the cabin. And then, sometime in the night, he heard her shift, not restless, just settling deeper, and it struck him then, in a way he could not quite explain, that she had not asked a single question since she arrived, not about him, not about the place, not about what came next, and yet she had stepped into it all the same, as if the absence of answers did not trouble her. And he stared up at the ceiling beams for a long moment before closing his eyes, the quiet around him no longer empty, but filled with something steady, something that did not demand anything from him except that he remain. Morning came in slow through the window, pale light slipping across the floorboards in thin lines that stretched toward the table, and Caleb was awake before it fully reached him, not because of habit this time, but because something had already changed in the room, something small and steady that did not belong to the silence he had known. And he lay there a moment longer than usual, listening. And there it was, the faint scrape of metal, the soft crackle of kindling catching in the stove, the quiet rhythm of someone moving with purpose. And when he pushed himself up onto one elbow, he saw her. Eliza standing by the stove with her back to him, her hair loosely gathered, her sleeves rolled just enough to keep them clear of her hands. And she was already working, already moving through the space as if she had risen with it, not waiting for the day to begin, but beginning it herself. And he sat up fully then, the blanket falling away, his boots still by the door where he had left them. And he reached for them, pulling them on without a word, his eyes drifting back to her in the way a man looks at something new but does not want to disturb it. And she did not turn right away, only after she had set a pot in place and checked the fire. Then she glanced over her shoulder and gave a small nod, not a greeting, not a question, just an acknowledgement that he was there. And he returned it with one of his own, rising to his feet and crossing to the basin, finding it already filled, the water clean and cold. And he paused for just a second at that, noticing, before washing his hands, the chill of it waking him fully. And when he turned back, the table had been set again, 2 plates placed in the same careful way as the night before, not exact, not measured with a ruler, but intentional. And he moved to his chair, pulling it out with a low scrape, sitting down while she finished what she was doing. And when she joined him, she did not rush, did not fill the space with talk, just sat and began when he did. The same quiet understanding settling between them without needing to be spoken. And the food was simple again. Eggs this time, cooked just right, bread warmed on the stove, and coffee, stronger than he had expected, the kind that held its weight. And he took a sip, pausing slightly, not because it was too hot, but because it was exactly how he would have made it if he had taken the time. And he glanced at her then, not long, just enough to register the detail. And she did not look up, just continued eating, and outside the light grew stronger, the sky clearing into a soft blue that promised a long day. And when he finished, he did not stand right away, his hands resting on the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the plate once before he spoke, saying there was work to be done along the south fence, a section that had been needing attention for some time, his voice carrying no expectation, just information. And she nodded once, setting her fork down. And when he stood, she did as well, moving to clear the table without being asked, her motions efficient but not hurried, stacking the plates, carrying them to the basin. And he stepped outside, the air cool against his face, the ground still holding a trace of the night. And he moved toward the barn, gathering what he needed, tools worn smooth from use. And when he turned back toward the house, he saw her coming across the yard, not empty-handed, a coil of rope in one hand, a small hammer in the other. And she did not call out, did not announce herself, just walked with a steady pace that matched his own. And when she reached him, she paused, meeting his eyes for a brief moment. And in that moment, there was no hesitation, no question, just a quiet readiness. And he gave a small nod, turning toward the fence line, and she fell into step beside him. The two of them moving forward into the day as if they had already agreed on something neither of them had spoken aloud. The fence line ran along the edge of the property where the land dipped slightly before rising again toward a stretch of scrub and open sky, the posts leaning in places where time and weather had worn them down. And Caleb set his tools down near the worst of it, scanning the line the way a man does when he already knows the work ahead but measures it anyway. And Eliza stood a step behind him, not crowding, not idle, just taking it in with the same quiet attention she gave everything else, her eyes moving from the broken rail to the sag in the wire, to the way the ground had shifted near the base of one post. And when he reached for the post hole digger, she did not wait for instruction, stepping forward to brace the first loose post with both hands, holding it steady without being asked. And he paused for half a second at that, then began, driving the digger into the earth with a steady rhythm, the metal biting into dry soil that gave way in small, stubborn clumps. And they worked, without speaking, the sound of it carrying across the open space, the scrape of tools, the dull thud of packed dirt, the low rustle of wind through grass. And after a while he noticed the way she shifted her grip when the post leaned, adjusting just enough to keep it true, not overcorrecting, not fighting it, just guiding it into place. And when he tamped the dirt down around the base, she did not let go right away, holding it firm until it settled, until it stood on its own. And then she stepped back, wiping her hands once against the side of her skirt before moving to the next section without waiting, and he followed. The pattern forming between them without needing to be named, and the sun climbed higher, the heat building in slow layers that pressed against the back of his neck, sweat gathering beneath the brim of his hat. And still they worked, moving down the line, replacing what needed replacing, tightening what could be saved. And at one point he reached for a length of wire, finding it already uncoiled and ready in her hands before he had to ask. And he took it with a small nod, threading it through the staples with practiced movements, and she held the tension steady, not pulling too tight, not letting it slack, just enough to keep it true. And he glanced at her then, not long, but long enough to see that she was not guessing, not learning as she went, but remembering something she had done before or something close to it. And the thought stayed with him as they moved on. And when they reached the last stretch, he set the tools down, straightening slowly, his back giving a quiet protest that he ignored. And she stood beside him, her breathing even despite the work, her hands marked now with a thin layer of dust, a faint redness along her palms where the wood had pressed. And she looked along the fence line they had just finished, not with pride, not with relief, just with a quiet acknowledgement that it was done. And he followed her gaze, seeing it as it should have been all along, straight, steady, holding its line against the open land. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the wind moving past them in a soft, constant sweep. And then he reached down, picking up the tools again, and she did the same, falling into step beside him as they turned back toward the house. The distance between them unchanged, but the space somehow different, filled now with something earned, something built in the hours between morning and midday that did not need to be spoken to be understood. By the time they reached the cabin again, the sun had begun its slow drop toward the horizon, the heat easing just enough to let the air move easier through the open space. And Caleb set the tools down by the barn without a word, wiping his hands once against his pants before stepping onto the porch, the boards giving a familiar creak beneath his weight. And Eliza followed a step behind, carrying the coil of rope with the same care she had carried everything else, not dragging it, not letting it unravel, just placing it where it belonged beside the door, as if she had always known its place. And inside the cabin the air held a different warmth now, not just from the sun but from use, from movement, from the small signs of life that had begun to settle into the walls. And she moved, first to the basin, filling it again from the bucket, the water still cool despite the day. And he watched her for a moment before turning to the shelf, reaching for a tin cup without needing to look, and she poured before he asked, handing it to him with that same quiet certainty. And he took it, nodding once, the gesture small but not unnoticed, and drank, the water cutting through the dust that had settled in his throat. And for a moment they stood there in the same space without speaking, the silence not empty but full in a way that neither of them seemed in a hurry to break. And then she moved past him toward the stove, checking the wood, adding a piece where it had burned low, adjusting the draft with a light touch that brought the flame back steady. And he leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely, watching again, not in suspicion, not in doubt, but in quiet recognition that what she was doing was not guesswork, not imitation, but something rooted deeper. And when she reached for a small tin from the shelf he had not touched in weeks, opening it to measure out just enough for the evening meal, he noticed the way she did not hesitate, did not search, as if the rhythm of it had already settled into her hands. And he spoke then, not to interrupt, but because the thought had come and would not leave, asking where she had learned to work a place like this, his voice even. And she paused only a moment before answering that a place is a place, and if it needs doing, you do it. Her words simple, offering no more than that. And he nodded slowly, accepting the answer even if it did not explain everything. And outside the wind picked up just enough to brush against the walls, a low, steady sound that carried through the open land. And inside the cabin the light shifted as the sun dropped lower, casting long shadows across the floor that stretched toward the table. And she moved to it without thinking, setting 2 plates again, the same quiet gesture that had begun to mark the passing of time in that house. And this time he noticed something else, a small fold of cloth placed beneath one of the plates, not decorative, not for show, but practical, to steady it against the uneven wood. And he watched her hands as she adjusted it, the care in the motion, the attention to something most would have ignored. and when she finished she stepped back, not waiting for acknowledgement, just letting it be, and he pushed off from the wall then, moving to the table, pulling out his chair with that same low scrape. And as he sat, he found himself looking at the space across from him before she took her seat, as if measuring it, as if noticing for the first time that it was no longer empty. And when she sat, the room settled around them again, the fire steady, the lights soft, and the silence between them carrying something new, something that had not been there the day before, not spoken, not defined, but present all the same, like a line drawn quietly across the day that neither of them had crossed alone. The next morning came quieter than the one before, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty anymore, but settled gently into the space. And Caleb woke to the faint sound of something different this time, not the stove, not the movement of water, but a soft, steady rhythm like paper brushing against wood. And when he opened his eyes, the light had already begun to fill the room, pale and clean, and Eliza was seated at the table, not working the stove, not moving through the usual motions, but still, a small stack of papers laid out in front of her, her hands moving over them with a careful precision that did not belong to guesswork. And he did not move right away, just watched from where he lay, the blanket pulled halfway over him, his gaze narrowing slightly as he took in the details. The way her fingers traced lines that were not visible from where he was, the way she paused at certain points as if measuring something unseen, and then she reached for a small piece of charcoal, making a mark along the edge of one page, not scribbling, not uncertain, but deliberate, and Caleb pushed himself up slowly, the floorboards giving a quiet creak beneath him, and she glanced up just once, meeting his eyes for a brief moment before lowering her gaze again, not hiding what she was doing, not explaining it either, just continuing as if it needed no introduction. And he stood, pulling on his boots, his attention still on the table as he crossed the room, and when he reached the basin he paused again, noticing that the water had already been drawn, but not yet used, as if she had chosen this work first, and he washed his hands in silence, the cool water grounding him. And when he turned back, she had gathered the papers neatly, stacking them with care before folding them into a cloth and setting them aside near her bundle. And only then did she rise, moving toward the stove to begin the morning routine as if nothing had interrupted it. And Caleb took his seat at the table without speaking, his eyes drifting once more to where the papers had been, the surface now clear except for the faint trace of charcoal dust that caught the light. And when she set his plate in front of him, he did not reach for it right away, his hand resting on the edge of the table as he looked up at her, not questioning, not accusing, just waiting. And she met his gaze for a second longer than usual, then said quietly that there were things worth keeping track of, her voice even, and he nodded once, slow, accepting the answer even if it raised more than it settled. And they ate in the same quiet rhythm as before, the food simple, the movement steady, but something had shifted again, something just beneath the surface. And after the meal he stood, stepping outside into the morning air, that carried a hint of coolness before the heat would rise again. And he paused on the porch, looking out across the land, his mind not on the fence this time or the work ahead, but on the image of her at the table, the papers, the marks, the way she had moved through it all with a certainty that did not match the story he had been given. And he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a long, quiet line, before stepping down into the yard. And behind him the door opened a moment later, the soft sound of her footsteps following, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, as if whatever had begun to reveal itself was not something she intended to hide, only something she would let be seen in its own time. By mid-morning the sun had climbed high enough to press a steady warmth across the land, and Caleb found himself working slower than usual, not from lack of strength, but from a distraction he could not quite name, his hands moving through familiar tasks while his thoughts stayed somewhere behind, back at the table, back at the quiet sound of charcoal against paper. And when he returned to the yard with an armful of split wood balanced against his hip, he noticed her near the barn, not waiting, not idle, but standing with one of the older ledgers he had long since stopped opening, its leather cover worn at the edges, its pages yellowed with time, and she had it open against the side of a crate, her head slightly tilted as she read, one finger resting lightly along a line as if following it. And he slowed his steps without meaning to, the weight of the wood shifting in his arms, and she did not look up right away. Only after she had reached the bottom of the page, turning it carefully. Before closing the book halfway, her gaze lifting to meet his with that same steady calm she always carried, and he set the wood down near the porch, brushing his hands together once before stepping closer, his eyes dropping briefly to the ledger before returning to her face, and he asked, not sharply, not accusing, just plain, if she knew how to read that kind of thing. And she answered without hesitation that numbers tell their own story if you listen long enough, her voice even, and he let out a slow breath, nodding once, though something in his expression had shifted, not doubt exactly, but a quiet awareness that the lines he had drawn in his mind were no longer holding their shape, and she turned the ledger slightly, not offering it, not withholding it, just letting it rest where it was, and he glanced down, catching sight of figures that had not been touched in months, entries half finished, totals left undone, and beside them, faint but clear, were new marks, corrections made with a careful hand, numbers aligned in a way that brought order where there had been none. And he looked back at her, the question in his eyes not spoken, and she said only that it needed balancing, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did, in a way that did not require more words, and he nodded again, slower this time, before stepping past her toward the well, giving himself a moment to think, to let the pieces settle where they would. And behind him she closed the ledger fully, placing it back on the crate with the same care she gave everything else, not claiming it, not hiding it, just leaving it as it should be. And when he returned with a bucket of water, she had already moved on, checking the line where the barn door hung slightly off its hinge, adjusting it with a few small taps of the hammer she had carried earlier, each strike measured, not forceful, just enough, and he stood a few feet away, watching again, the pattern repeating itself in a way that no longer felt like coincidence. And as the day stretched on, the work continued. But something had begun to take shape beneath it all, something quiet but undeniable, like a line drawn through the middle of what he thought he knew and what he was beginning to see. And for the first time since she had stepped off that crate, Caleb Boone found himself wondering not what she would become, but what she had been all along. That evening came slower than the others, the light lingering longer along the horizon as if the day itself was not quite ready to settle. And inside the cabin the air held that same quiet fullness that had begun to take shape between them, the kind that did not need to be filled with words. And Caleb sat at the table after supper, not rising right away, his hands resting flat against the wood, his eyes drifting to the ledger she had brought in from the barn, now set near the edge of the table within reach. And Eliza moved through the room with her usual steady rhythm, rinsing the last of the dishes, setting them to dry, her back to him but not distant, just present in the same space. And after a moment he reached for the ledger, pulling it closer, opening it to the pages he had seen earlier, the numbers lined in careful rows, some faded with time, others newly marked. And he traced one column with his finger, slow, reading it in a way he had not done in months. And something shifted in his expression as he followed the figures, the inconsistencies he had grown used to ignoring now standing out where they had been corrected, balanced, made right. And he glanced up then, his gaze settling on her as she finished at the basin, drying her hands on a cloth before turning to face him. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching but not breaking. And then he asked, quiet but direct, how long she had known how to do that, his voice carrying no edge, just a need to understand. And she held his gaze for a second, not avoiding it, not softening it either. And then she stepped closer, stopping at the other side of the table, her hands resting lightly against the back of the chair. And she said that she had learned when it was expected of her, when mistakes cost more than time, her words measured. And he nodded once, absorbing that, his eyes dropping briefly back to the page before lifting again. And he asked what else she had learned, the question simple but carrying more beneath it. And she did not answer right away, her gaze shifting slightly to the window where the last of the light was fading, then back to him. And she said that there are places where you are taught to make things appear smaller than they are, to stay quiet so no one looks too closely, her voice even, and the words settled into the room like something that had been waiting to be said. And Caleb leaned back slightly, in his chair, his hands still resting on the ledger, and he studied her then, not the way he had at the yard, not searching for signs, but seeing what was already there. the steadiness in her posture, the certainty in the way she stood, and something in his expression softened, not into a smile, not into anything easily named, but into recognition, and he closed the ledger gently, sliding it back across the table toward her without pushing it away, just placing it within her reach again, and he said, quiet but certain, that she did not have to make herself smaller here, and the words hung in the air between them, simple, unadorned, and she did not respond right away, just stood there, her hands still on the chair, her gaze steady on his, and then she gave a small nod, not agreeing, not denying, just acknowledging, and after a moment she moved to set the ledger aside, placing it near her things without hiding it, and the room settled again, the fire low, the night pressing gently against the walls, and Caleb remained at the table a moment longer before standing, the chair scraping softly behind him, and as he moved toward the door he paused, glancing back once more, not at the ledger this time, but at her, and in that glance there was no question left, only the quiet understanding that whatever story had been told about her before she arrived had not come close to the truth. The next day carried a different weight to it, not heavy, not pressing, but present in a way that could not be ignored, and the sky stretched wide and clear above the ranch as Caleb moved through his usual morning work with a steadiness that now held something more deliberate beneath it, his thoughts no longer circling questions but settling into quiet conclusions. And when he stepped back toward the cabin near midday, the sun high and bright, he found the door open and Eliza at the table again. The same papers spread before her, but this time there was no attempt to fold them away, no pause to hide what she was doing, just the steady movement of her hands as she worked through them, marking, aligning, correcting, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment, not announcing himself, not interrupting, just watching as the pieces of something larger began to take shape in front of him. And when she finished the page, she set the charcoal down and looked up, meeting his eyes. Without hesitation, and there was no question there, no uncertainty, just a quiet acceptance of being seen, and he stepped inside then, closing the distance between them without hurry, his gaze dropping briefly to the papers, to the figures that now made sense in a way they had not before, and then back to her, and he said, simple and certain, that the land had been losing money for 2 seasons, that he had known it but had not had the time or the patience to set it right, and she nodded once. Not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the truth of it, and she said that it could be fixed, that the numbers were not wrong, only mismanaged, her voice calm, and he let out a slow breath at that, something easing in his chest that he had not realized he had been carrying, and he pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down without asking if he should, his hands resting on the table as he leaned forward slightly, his attention fully on her now, and he asked what it would take, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, and she did not rush to answer, her eyes moving once more over the papers before she spoke, laying it out in simple terms, where the losses had come from, where the gains could be found, her words clear, measured, not dressed up, just true, and he listened, really listened, in a way he had not done in a long time, and when she finished there was a moment of quiet, the kind that comes after something important has been said, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady on her, and he nodded once, firm this time, and said that they would do it her way, the words coming without hesitation, without condition, and she held his gaze for a second longer, something shifting in her expression, not surprise, not relief, but something quieter, something closer to trust, and she gave a small nod in return, and the moment passed without ceremony, without anything more needing to be said, and outside the wind moved through the grass, in a steady line, the sound carrying into the cabin through the open door, and inside the two of them sat across from each other at the table, the papers between them, not as a barrier but as a bridge, and for the first time since she had arrived, the shape of what they were building together began to take form, not from what she had been worth to others, not from what he had paid, but from what they had chosen to see in each other and the quiet work that followed. Some things do not change all at once, they settle in piece by piece, like dust after a long day's work, and over the weeks that followed, the ranch began to show it in quiet ways, not in grand gestures or sudden turns, but in small, steady improvements that held their ground, the fence line standing straight against the wind, the ledgers balanced and kept in order, the the store of grain measured with care instead of guesswork. And Caleb found himself moving through each day with a different kind of certainty, not the kind that comes from knowing everything, but the kind that comes from no longer having to carry it all alone. And Eliza moved beside that life as if she had always belonged there, not claiming it, not reshaping it beyond recognition, but refining it, bringing it into focus. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky stretched wide in soft shades of gold and blue, Caleb returned from the far side of the property, dust on his boots and the weight of the day settled into his shoulders, and he stepped onto the porch to find the door already open, the warm light inside reaching out to meet him. And when he walked in, the table was set, 2 plates placed side by side, a pot on the stove giving off the steady scent of supper, and Eliza stood near the window, looking out at the land that now carried both their work in its quiet lines. And he paused there for a moment, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see it as it was, the room, the table, her, standing there in the fading light. And he crossed to the table, setting his hat down in its usual place before pulling out his chair, the sound of it no longer sharp against the silence, but part of something larger. And she turned then, meeting his eyes with that same calm steadiness. And for a second there was something unspoken between them, not new, not uncertain, but settled. And he said, quiet but sure, that the place was holding better than it had in years. And she nodded once, not taking credit, not deflecting it, just accepting the truth of it. And he added after a moment that he had known the land needed fixing, but he had not known how much he did too. The words simple, spoken without weight. And she held his gaze a second longer before giving that same small nod. And they sat down together, beginning the meal in that same quiet rhythm that had come to define their days. And outside the wind moved across the open fields, the sound steady and familiar. And inside the fire burned low and warm, the lights soft against the walls. And when the meal was done and the plates cleared, Caleb remained at the table a moment longer, his hand resting against the wood where the 2 plates had been. And he looked up at her, not searching, not questioning, just certain. And he said that whatever she had been worth to the world before she came here, it had not been enough, not by a long shot. And she did not answer with words, only with a look that held steady. And in that look there was no need to explain, no need to prove, only the quiet understanding that value is not something given by those who fail to see it, but something revealed over time to those who do. And as the night settled in around them, the cabin standing firm against the dark, the 2 of them moved through the small, familiar motions of closing out the day, the door secured, the fire banked, the space set in order. And when they finally lay down, the silence that filled the room was no longer the silence of being alone, but the kind that comes when 2 people share the same place, the same work, and the same quiet knowing that they had found something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them had needed all along.